At a time when so many of us feel like our connections with people are distant and conversations are surface level, really engaging with each other takes intention. I'm Ashley Gould, the founder of Attend, an elevated, everyday home brand with products that set the table for meaningful spaces and gatherings. Our podcast builds on those spaces through dynamic discussions with open-hearted people, with the goal of sparking conversation around your table. From September through the end of the year, we'll be exploring one of the most universal and unspoken subjects, death and dying. Very few of us know how to prepare for, talk about, and support others through end of life. In this 8-part series, I interview guests whose personal lives and professions are intimately tied to the subject. Join me in an exploration of how to find more peace in preparing for death.
A quick note from the On the Table with Ashley team. We've split Heather Mansson and Ashley's conversation into 2 parts. This is part 1, and part 2 will be coming out on September 25th. Enjoy.
Welcome to On the Table with Ashley, a podcast where I explore ways in which we can lead more fulfilling lives and amplify human connection by increasing our curiosity and communicating with less judgment and more respect. It's my pleasure to welcome Heather Mansson to On the Table with Ashley today. Heather is a pharmacist by training who left her career in pharmacy 15 years ago to become a yoga instructor. Heather, her husband Rob, and 3 children moved from North Carolina to Park City, Utah in June of 2020. Just after moving, Heather and Rob's youngest child, Parker, who was 9 years old at the time, was diagnosed with an aggressive form of soft tissue sarcoma. Parker underwent multiple surgeries, treatment with an MEK inhibitor, and multiple rounds of chemotherapy and radiation treatment. In May of 2022, which Heather noted before we started recording today, was exactly 2 years ago today, following the recurrence of tumors after all of the various treatments, Parker began to receive palliative care, and just a few weeks later passed away with Rob and Heather by her side. Parker was 11 years old. It was during Parker's grueling chemotherapy treatments that the Manssons began to think about the idea of starting an organization to support others going through what they were experiencing. The Little P Project was born out of the pain of losing Parker and helps to bring hope to many families. Here are a few facts I learned on the Little P Project website. Every 3 minutes, a child is diagnosed with cancer. Annually in the United States, approximately 15,000 children are told they have cancer. Childhood cancer is underfunded. The National Cancer Institute, or NCI, only spends an average of 4% of its research funding on all pediatric cancers combined. Over 200 cancer drugs have been developed and approved for adults. Specific to children, only 6 drugs have been approved for pediatric cancer. In addition to supporting research in an effort to get more medicines approved for pediatric cancer, the Little P Project helps support families at Salt Lake City's Primary Children's Hospital whose kids have been diagnosed with cancer and are financially compromised, helping with rent, gas, etc., and to help cover the cost of some of the treatments. Establishing the Little P Project has also helped the Mansson family create meaning around such tragedy and loss. We'll talk more about how you can help the Little P Project on this episode. And I want to encourage everyone to visit the Little P Project website at littlepproject.org upfront, where you can learn so much more about Parker and you can donate. Heather, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I always like to start my conversation hearing a little bit about your childhood. So can you tell us where you grew up and what kind of kid you were when you were young?
Yes, I grew up in a small town in Tennessee, West Tennessee, and a big family, 4 kids, and 2 amazing parents. Our house was filled with music. My dad's a musician, my brother's a musician, And I was just the typical kid that like loved to play outdoors. And I just remember as a kid getting home from school, we would change out of our like school clothes and put on our play clothes, and we would stay outside till the sun went down. And my sister and I loved dancing, and we would perform, and anything like that was always celebrated. And we got like undivided attention when we put on these like dance performances. So yeah, it was a pretty fun, magical childhood, child of the 80s. Growing up, the parents weren't as hovering back then.
Yeah.
And we kind of, could do our own thing. And as long as we came home when the sun went down, we were good. So
it sounds like a wonderful childhood.
It was. It truly was.
So what do you think motivated you to become a pharmacist and then to leave that line of work and become a yoga instructor?
Good question. I remember thinking about what I wanted to do in middle school, and I knew that the intention behind whatever I wanted to do was to help people.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew I couldn't be a doctor. Like I knew that I could not deal with some of the blood and all the things that go along with being a doctor. So for me, pharmacy was a little bit removed from that.
Mm-hmm.
And I could still be in the healthcare field and help. So that was my intention originally. And I was decent at math and science. So I was thinking like I would really love that line of work.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize until I really got into the field that you're so separated from your patients. You're almost like the middleman.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times when you would see a patient, they're either frustrated because they are sick, and then you are the barrier between them getting their medicine. So it kind of robs some of that feeling of like helping.
Yeah.
And then I pivoted to hospital, and I did hospital the longest out of anything I did in pharmacy. And I really, out of anything I did, that was what I enjoyed the most. And I think helping component of it was more of helping nurses take care of their patients. But after years of doing that, it was very stressful.
Mm-hmm.
And I had 3 kids, and I decided that I've always wanted to learn more about yoga. And I think when you teach anything, you learn. And my dad growing up practiced yoga, which is kind of odd for someone in a small town in Tennessee to practice yoga. There were no yoga studios in our small town, but my dad used to get up every morning, go to his music room and meditate and do some yoga. And I remember as a little girl, I would go in his room and look at all his yoga books and like be like, wow, I want to do that one day. But then as I got older, I realized the peace that my dad had. He was just very measured, just had that like grounding energy of someone. And I attributed that to yoga. And as I had kids, I wanted that. So I thought, well, let me teach it, because if I can teach it, I'm going to learn as much as I can about it. And then I'm going to help others, so be of service to others, more one-on-one than be as removed as I was in pharmacy. And I did actually my first yoga training when I was pregnant with my first child.
Really?
Yeah. I signed up before I found out I was pregnant, and then thought about dropping out. So I was like, well, I'm pregnant. I've got a full-time job. And then the yoga teacher was like, this is a perfect time to do a yoga teacher training during your, pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
And she was right. It was almost a year-long training. So I ended up having my daughter Maisie before I finished, but I completed it and was ready to go, ready to teach yoga. And then I had a newborn, and that's a lot. And I was still working part-time. So I put that on hold. I still practiced yoga. And by the time Parker, our youngest, went to kindergarten, I said, okay, now I'm going all in. I'm going to do another teacher training, and I'm going to really try this on and see how this goes. And I am an all or nothing person. So as I finished my second yoga teacher training, I was only working PRN in the hospital setting, which is just as needed. And I quit that job. And I said, no, this is what I'm going to do. I'm just going to pivot completely over to this total different job in a way that I feel like I could be more of service to others. And while that sounded great, it was harder than I thought to get my foot in the door to find a place to teach. And in Charlotte, yoga is huge. There's not as much outdoors life like you have here. People don't recreate a lot there. So yoga is typically like what people do. And so there were a lot of yoga studios, which meant there were a lot of competition. They were all businesses. And getting my foot in the door was tough in the beginning, but I'm glad I persisted and just kept trying. And eventually I taught yoga at a place that felt like a good fit for me. And I grew a lot. Mm-hmm. I really did. I think when you teach yoga, you are really putting yourself out there. It's not only that you're teaching this practice of yoga, you're also putting yourself out there in a way that's like, if they like me, they'll come back to my class. Mm-hmm. And that judgment was really hard for me in the beginning. And it's still hard, to be honest. Yeah. But I just have to stay true to who I am and teach in a genuine, authentic way that is aligned with myself and let go of the rest. And I think it's one of those professions that you continuously grow in. And I'm really grateful for that pivot towards something that I think is more aligned with who I am.
So I know there are like a lot of different kinds of yoga. Did you get trained in one specific kind, and do you do like ongoing trainings, or how are you kind of keeping yourself, I don't know, inspired?
Yes, my first teacher training was all types of yoga, like Kundalini, Iyengar, Ashtanga. And so we could try every type on, and they are very different. And I think for me, I like the flow. Okay. I like the flowy kind. To me, it's almost like dancing, but a meditative dance. Mm-hmm. So I connected with that the most. Mm-hmm. And then my second teacher training was Ashtanga based, which is power yoga. And they really took that lineage and built their own kind of yoga program that was more of a flow yoga. And Ashtanga is a type of yoga that it's rigorous. And for me, it felt like almost that it wasn't as a healing practice for me as it was for others. Like I felt like I was getting injured more, like my shoulder or my hip.
Interesting.
And so I put that down and I just said, okay, I'm just going to teach vinyasa, flow yoga, and bring in some elements of different types of yoga that I've learned. Mm-hmm. But for me, that was like, again, that's just what felt good to me. And when I moved to Park City, I teach at PC Yoga Collective. And the owner there, Jen Solomon, is absolutely wonderful. And she really celebrates however you want to teach. And I remember when she talked to me about subbing, I wasn't sure that I was ready to go back to teaching because since COVID and Parker, I'd stopped teaching and I was completely devoted towards Parker's treatment and getting her well. And I didn't know if I'd ever want to go back, honestly, because I was just in such a vulnerable state. And Jen encouraged me to come back to teach and that it would really help my grief. And my next thing I said to her, I was like, well, you haven't even seen me teach. I don't know if you really want to offer me a job yet. But she said, no, I want you to teach. And I really know you're a good teacher without watching you teach. So I am so grateful for that opportunity. And the community there has been so supportive. And as far as like keeping that teaching inspiration going, Jen does that because she does a 300-hour training. And I've already done a 300-hour training after I'd done my 200. But you always are evolving as a teacher. And there are sometimes I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I taught it that way. That was totally wrong. And this is the right way. And I'm sure like 5 years down the road, I'm going to look back at how I'm teaching now and be like, that was totally not correct. I should have said this. And so just like anything, we're always growing.
It's a practice.
It's a practice. And yeah, so she really gives us that space to grow as teachers and embraces where we are and meets us where we are.
Well, it sounds amazing. I think I need to check it out.
Yeah.
I'm very bad at yoga, but I will try. How did you decide to move from North Carolina to Park City?
Good question. So we moved to Charlotte. First of all, I met my husband in Jackson, Wyoming. I was folding t-shirts. I was doing a pharmacy rotation. And I met him. He worked at the t-shirt shop down the street, but it was the same company. And dating in some place like that that's so beautiful. And I just felt like I felt this nudge that like, I'm going to come back. Like, this is where I'm meant to be.
Mm-hmm.
And he also felt that way because he grew up in the mountains. And so when we moved to Charlotte, it was originally just for jobs. And we were starting out as a young family, raising kids. And you're just at that point, just in survival mode and setting yourself up in a good position with your career. And then it felt like, this just doesn't feel like home.
Mm.
And we had been there at least at that point, like 15 years. And we had always talked about moving back west, but we couldn't figure out how we would make that happen, given our jobs, specifically his job in banking. But we, decided, no, this is what we want to do. We want to make this happen. And originally it was Jackson. We were going to move back to Jackson. And we hit a lot of blocks in that journey of getting that to happen, making that happen. And the kids were doing ski team at the time in this like ski hill in North Carolina, which is not like the best ski, but we didn't care. Like, we're in the mountains and we're doing something outside with the kids, so it's fine. But I'll never forget, we were there for that ski weekend and Park City came up in my mind. And I was like, why don't we look at Park City? Could you not work in Salt Lake City? Like, clearly that's a city. There's probably more opportunities in a rural, like, ski town like Jackson. And after that, it was crazy because it was like, okay, Park City, let's look at Park City. And then it's like synchronistically things started happening. Like, there was a job that popped open in Salt Lake. I remember teaching yoga one night. And it wasn't even my class. It was like a class I was subbing. And this guy came up to me after my class, was like, hey, you're new here. And I was like, I'm not actually new here, but I don't usually teach this class at night. And he said, well, I just moved to Charlotte. And I said, oh, where are you from? He said, Park City. And I was like, my husband and I are trying to move to Park City. And he was just went on and on about how much he loved Park City and how amazing it is to raise kids and like all the things. And it took a while, I think, once my husband found the right job for us to make the move. And once that happened, COVID hit. And we had already planned to sell our house. We were going to rent. We were going to figure out where we wanted to live once we got out here. We didn't know anyone, but we were like, this is an adventure. We're just going to go for it. And then when the pandemic happened, we were like, okay, what are we going to do? Like, the world is like totally falling apart right now. And we're really going to put, 3 kids and a cat and a dog and travel out west to somewhere we've never like lived or where we know no one. And it was just, again, that nudge of like, yes, you are, and it'll be okay. You will be fine. Just keep moving forward. And right in the middle of a pandemic when no one could sell a house, we sold our house, the first showing. We got a rental, like, through a friend of a friend that lived in Park City. Down the street from her, there was a house for rent. So things aligned to where it was like, okay, we're going to go. And it may sound crazy to do this in the middle of a pandemic, but we're just going to do it. And looking back now, I can see why there was an urgency to the move, especially with Parker getting sick, that we needed to get here and get here quickly. And I'm grateful that we listened to that intuition, that voice that tells you, just go.
Yeah.
You'll be okay. It'll work out. Just go.
Absolutely. Can you share Parker's journey from diagnosis to passing? And let's just start there, and then let's talk about the Little P Project.
Okay. So when we were driving out west, Parker did not look good. She just looked pale. And I was really concerned. My husband wasn't so much. He was like, she's fine, but I worried. And I felt it like in my gut that something is not okay. And I took her heart rate, and her heart rate was pretty high. And we were in the middle, I think we were in Kansas City at the time. And I called two of my friends. One was an ER pediatric doctor in Charlotte, and the other one was her pediatrician in Charlotte. And they said, oh, she's okay. Just no need to take her to urgent care. She's going to be okay. But when you get to Park City, take her to the doctor. And then, so we stopped in Denver, and I literally, the night before driving to Park City, and we spent the night in Denver, I didn't sleep a minute. Like I just was like so worried. And as soon as we got to our rental house, I drove her to the pediatrician here. Again, I didn't know my way around. I didn't even know if that was the right place to take her. But when I took her, the pediatrician said her blood pressure is really low and her heart rate's really high. She might need a blood transfusion. She needs to go to primary children's. And I was like, okay, trying to stay calm. Where's primary children's? And she's like, it's in Salt Lake. And I was thinking, Salt Lake, okay, how do I get there? Like, we just driven, for 3 days and I'll get back in the car and then drive down this canyon. And I did it by myself because at the time you
didn't know.
One parent can only go into the hospital. And the other two kids, were unpacking with Dad, the rental. So I drove her down that night, and after running blood tests and everything, they said she had anemia and she didn't actually need a blood transfusion. So they put her on some iron drops. And I was like, wow, that's like anemia. Like it made sense, like her looking pale and then her heart rate being high. I know those are two symptoms that can happen when you're anemic, but they were thinking it was from her diet. And she, during COVID, did complain about her tummy hurting a little bit. And she also stopped eating meat, but she was a huge animal lover and pigs were her favorite. So she was not about to ever eat another piece of bacon. So I thought possibly that could be what it was, that she had stopped eating meat. But I was like, it's not like she stopped eating meat for years. It's just like a few months. So anyway, put her on iron drops, and within 10 days, she started throwing up. But it wasn't she wasn't vomiting like a stomach bug. It was just different. And I didn't feel good about it. We were supposed to go to Jackson to see family. And I said, I don't think she can go. We have to take her back to the ER. So my husband took her back to the ER that night, and they ended up keeping her, and they thought she had constipation. So they kept her at primaries for 5 days before they figured out what was going on. What it was is she had a bowel obstruction from the tumor in her small intestine. And for any moms listening out there, I just want to say, sometimes you have to pound the table when you really need something looked at. And with her, I was doing that. I was like, she's not better. And they had done all these feeding tubes and she couldn't keep them down. And it's almost like her body was saying, alert, alert, like you need to look further.
Yeah.
This is not just constipation. And anyway, they ended up doing a CT scan, and the CT scan showed a blockage in her small intestine. So they did surgery that night, emergency surgery. And they didn't think it was cancerous. They said it didn't look cancerous. Thought it might be a polyp or something. But then they were going to call us back within 7 days. And they didn't call in 7 days. So I ended up calling and saying, like, we haven't gotten the pathology results back, just checking in. And at the time, whomever I talked to said, oh, they were clear. And they did do some pathology reports just on her, like, GI tract when they put in some of the feeding tubes. But this was different. And I actually asked more questions about, well, wait, which ones are you talking about? And I said, no, this is the one they took from surgery. And they're like, oh, right. Okay, we'll have to have the surgeon call you back. And then he called back and said that he was referring us to oncology, that it appeared to be a tumor. And that really was the day that this all started. So I would say that was probably around 1st of July, like probably second week of July. And when she got the diagnosis of it being sarcoma, I refused to go online and look at anything because I knew I had to stay in a positive mindset around this, and I didn't want to scare her.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, we were debating, do we reverse this move? Do we move back to Charlotte? We don't know anyone here. We don't know anyone in the medical, arena.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have family here. It just felt very scary, and it felt very alone. And we drove back to Tennessee and stayed with family to figure out what our next move was. And in the meantime, her oncologist here was meeting with other oncologists to determine what does she need moving forward. And it was decided after 2 weeks that she needed to come back and have a second surgery to make sure they got clear margins from the first.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like when we came back for that we were going to stay. Even though, again, we didn't know anyone, we didn't have family around, it felt right, like this is where she needs to be. And so that was quite the journey once we moved back to Park City. And that time, within like the next couple of months, we bought a house. I'm a Cancer. So I like to feel at home wherever I am. And there was a sense of urgency to like, we need to buy a house. Like, I don't care where, just we need to buy a house.
Yeah, you needed a home.
And where we ended up buying, it was like almost like divine intervention, because Parker ended up meeting her two best friends. They lived in the neighborhood, and we ended up meeting families that are still our very, very close friends now, and that were so supportive. And I think that being in Park City during Parker's diagnosis, to have this like beautiful place, it's a healing place. And to have that when she was sick, but also to have that when we lost her, was necessary.
Yeah.
For our healing.
And still
today. I think looking at particularly my husband and being like in Charlotte, and I think for years he was already depleting in Charlotte because he is a mountain boy at heart, and just living that day to day was just breaking him down.
Yeah.
And I couldn't imagine going through what we've been through and not be here.
Yeah.
And the amount of love and support from this community. I was just saying to my husband this morning, I've never felt more a part of a community than I do here. Not to say I didn't love Charlotte. I love Charlotte, and I still love my friends there. But there's just something special here. People didn't even know us, and they came and brought us food, and they walked our puppy, and that compassion and that support, it's like, it's really what carried us, and it still carries us now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I know she had chemotherapy She had multiple surgeries, and all of that spanned almost 2 years. Is that right?
Yes, she had 4 surgeries. She had 2 that were close together.
Okay.
And that was around her small intestine. Unfortunately, her cancer was abdominal. So when they would do surgeries, it would be pretty invasive. So they'd have to go in and cut out some of the colon or take her appendix, which, usually that's not uncommon for the appendix, but they took some of her ovaries. And, it was just heartbreaking to see her go through all of that. But she was so resilient. She just wanted to live.
Yeah.
And she was up for whatever they said she needed to do. So the surgeries were really hard. The chemo was also very hard because after chemo, you just don't feel good. She don't feel good, and she tried to feel okay. And a lot of her recovery from that was in bed, and there were moments of her coming out and just sitting outside and playing with her puppy. But yeah, so the treatments are pretty brutal. And for a child, their little bodies.
Yeah.
It's just excruciating to see all the suffering that goes along with that.
And were all of the treatments in Salt Lake, or some of them you traveled for?
All in Salt Lake except for her radiation that we did in New York City.
Okay.
And that was at Sloan Kettering. And the reason why we went there is because after they did her last surgery was very aggressive. And they said up front, it's going to be very aggressive. And of course, it's our choice if we want to do it.
Right.
For us, it's like, yeah, of course you do it.
Yeah.
So after that, they were also going to have to do radiation to clean up if there's any other cancer cells. But the Sloan Kettering place radiation clinic there did full abdominal radiation multiple times a year. So I knew that they could do it safely and effectively. And I think as you go into any type of radiation treatment, safety is a big component to that decision. So we went to New York for that for a month. Parker did not like it at all. She is not a city girl. She did not like all the noise and the cars and people. And I think her favorite part of living in New York was going to Central Park and playing with the dogs at the dog park. But it was really hard on her because she missed her friends. She missed her pets. She missed her sister and her brother. And I hope she understands now why we made that choice. I think as a parent, you're always making decisions that are going to keep your child safe.
Yeah.
And so yeah, but the good part of that, of her being there, she got to spend some more time with her godparents. They live there, and she enjoyed that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And her care at Primary Children's was excellent. Truly, it really was excellent. She had an amazing relationship with her oncologist, Dr. Fair. She adored him.
Is he the doctor who was at the fundraiser?
Yes,
okay.
Yeah.
He was wonderful.
Yeah, he's wonderful. And she actually described him in her journal. Well, I actually wrote it in my journal, but she told me that Dr. Fair was homey. And I said, homey, what do you mean by homey? And she said, he feels like home. And I thought, well, that's the kind of doctor you want to have.
That is absolutely the doctor you want. Yes.
And she, in her last month, she wanted to go back to the hospital. She did not want to be at home.
Interesting.
And I think that was almost her gift to us, because I think she knew that would be really hard on us as a family to continue on in our home without her and go through that experience. But I think she also felt, being at the hospital at Primary Children's, she was safe.
Yeah.
She was safe, and she was loved, and she was cared for. And so, yeah. And I think that goes back to moving, and that, that voice that tells you, just go, just go, that nudge, to listen to that, because I think that experience would have been different if we had stayed.
Yeah. And it's amazing at her age that she could even articulate, this is what I want now.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is. She's an old soul.
Yeah.
She is. I loved being her mom, and she was mothering to me. It was like a very symbiotic relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you told me earlier it's 2 years today since she passed. Before we talk about the Little P Project, can you just tell us about her?
Yeah.
I mean, and just another plug for everybody, go to the Little P Project website and your Instagram as well. I mean, I think it's one fortunate thing is that she grew up in a time when we had our iPhones. So you have a lot of videos and pictures. And, like when we were children, we don't have that many. I don't know if I have any videos of me as a child, so I think that is a gift. And it's a gift that for you and your family, but also so other people can know her. And I think she just seemed to have this exuberant personality and this light within her. So if you could just talk a little bit about her, and I know that's hard. And so whatever you feel comfortable sharing, I just think it's part of people contributing to her legacy is knowing her.
Yeah, sure. As I told you, I didn't realize when we scheduled this podcast what day it was. And to me, it's like divine timing that it is today, because I do get an opportunity to share about Parker and who she is, who she was, all the beautiful, beautiful things about her spirit. Parker is one of those human beings. When you're around her, you don't forget her.
Yeah.
Truly. And this was before she got sick. I mean, she just had that bright, bright light. And whomever she was around, she made them feel seen.
Yeah.
And loved. She was unapologetically herself. So she was kind, for sure, empathetic, but she also was strong in who she was.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, seeing that in someone inspires me to be that as well, especially growing up in the South, where you're just told, be kind, be nice, be sweet. And so you diminish part of who you are.
Yeah.
To present yourself in that way to other people.
Yeah.
She held both. And she loved life. And she saw the beauty in the ordinary. She loved the little creatures that, some kids would find gross. She thought they were beautiful and would hold them in her hands. And I talked about this at the gala, but I remember a rainy day when it was just like really raining hard in Charlotte. And so all the worms would come to the surface, and she felt sorry for the worms. So she ran out there in her bare feet and was like trying to put the mud back over them. And so she loved animals. She loved the earth. She wanted to take care of the earth. She knew how important that was.
Yeah.
To understand that everything really mattered. Everything we do matters. Even if it's small, it really matters. And she was quite the entertainer in her house. And it's funny, people said, how did you even know to video her, just randomly dancing in the house or singing? And I'm like, how could you not? You got to capture that. It's just she was just a force.
Yeah.
And also, I think growing up in a home where that was celebrated too.
Yeah.
I mean, my parents have videotapes that shows my age. Videotapes of my sister and I dancing and singing. So we just, it's just part of our culture of having kids. You just celebrate everything about them. And she was easy to celebrate.
Yeah.
She was easy to love. One of my favorite things about her too was, and her teachers would tell me this, and I giggle because I'm like, well, wait, didn't you have my other two kids too? They would say Parker's one of those kids, we only get them every couple of years, just one. But she really is so compassionate. She's a helper. She looks around in the classroom for a kid that might need help. And she does it without anything attached to it. Yeah. It's just her nature, the essence of who she is. And I do think her brother and sister do that as well. Let me be clear about that. But I think just being Parker and who she was just lived so big, her heart outside of her body. Just here I am. And she didn't diminish any of that. And so I think it's probably easy to see in her.
Yeah.
And she's so wise, truly. Like, as our third, your first two, you feel a little clumsy as a mom, especially your first. But with her, she just made mothering really easy. And she brought you back to yourself too when you were a child. Like, to see the world through her eyes. It reminds you that you can do that still. Like, we all can still do that.
We can all still do that.
And then her laugh was so infectious. She was so precocious. Like, we used to, and it's probably bad parenting on my part, but I still love it, the show Arrested Development. And my husband and I we would watch it. But by default, the kids would end up watching it with us because we wanted to watch it. And she loved it. Like, she loved some of the characters on there. And like, it's just like she got things.
Yeah.
As a little kid.
Yeah.
Like, really, yeah.
She loved to dance, right?
Oh, yeah. She was so creative and expressive. And one of my favorite quotes that she said was, "I feel free when I'm dancing. And when I'm not dancing, I feel like the Tin Man off Wizard of Oz." That was her verbal way of describing like how she feels in her body.
Yeah.
And I think about that quote because she mentioned the word free in her last days, that's what she wanted was to be free.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love that I get to talk about her today and honor her and talk about her life.
Yeah.
Because I think today is like a day that people think about her death. But to me, I want to just be reminded of her life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what she, left us and what she's continuing to give us and allow us to just keep sharing that and spreading that with other people in our interactions, whether they're here or they're even at the grocery store, just do your exchange with people.
Yeah.
And seeing them the way Parker saw people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's a good way to live.
Yeah.
It's a good way to live. And I think that's a great transition to talk about the Little Pea Project. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but to me, it is a way to keep her alive and to keep her memory alive and to try to make sense of the loss, which I'm guessing is not possible. But it is to me a way to keep her alive. I mean, so you have an annual fundraiser. Well, I want you to describe it, but you have an annual fundraiser, and my husband, Carlos, and I recently attended this, I think it's the second annual fundraiser. And it was really quite an evening. So you were amazing. Your speech was amazing. And I don't know how you did it. The MC was amazing. Molly Bice Jackson, who has her own story of loss, losing her child choking on an apple. I think it was over a decade ago. There was a health scare with the ambulance coming, and we've heard that the man is okay, thankfully. And you had, they were heart-wrenching, beautiful videos of Parker and the dancers who were honoring her. So I loved, you had a video of her singing, "This Girl Is on Fire," and then the dancers started dancing to that song. It was such a beautiful thing. And then it ended with the auction and a puppy that a family got to go home with, which seems like a very nice way to end the evening. So I'd love to hear about how you and your husband decided to start the Little Pea Project, what your goals are, both financially and personally, and even did you meet your goal for this year? And then let's talk about how people can donate or get involved. But I really want to start with, how you decided to do it.
I think going through all of that with Parker, I had a totally different view of cancer and children with cancer. I think the images you see sometimes are, I think St. Jude is wonderful, but some of the images you see through St. Jude are kids happy. And so when you see those images, you don't think of death. You don't think that, you think there's treatment. There's treatment. They're going to be okay. And then when we were walking through that journey with Parker, I thought there has to be options. There have to be. Like, if this doesn't work, there's another option. What's our other option? Like, the thought of losing her was just to me seemed like impossible. And now it is our reality. And we realize that there aren't many options for children. And with Parker, their options were the harshest chemos you can really give, even an adult. One of the drugs is called the Red Devil, and you have to be hospitalized to get that into your body. And it's like my eyes were open to a totally different view of pediatric cancer. And then it made me angry, especially being a pharmacist and knowing all the drugs there are out there for all the different elements, and yet we don't have drugs for this. It just seemed like, again, it was like a nightmare. Like, you kept thinking, there's something out there. Like, there's got to be a study out there with her type of cancer and what drug they tried, and that child survived. And what we learned is that's not the case. And really, all they have, particularly with Parker's type of cancer, were different amounts of chemo or different recipe of chemo. And I wasn't scared of chemo. Honestly, I didn't like the suffering that's involved in it. But if it's saving your child's life, you're like, I celebrate the chemo. I bless the chemo. But when that didn't work, you're left with and now what? And I think that anger of this landscape of treatment for our children who have cancer is what really birthed Little P Project. And when my husband and I talked about it, and it was right after Parker passed, and of course everybody's sending you things and flowers and but I thought, no. I'd rather people, if they're going to donate or give, let's create something that has a little bit more meaning and that helps others. And that's how it all started. It was literally after we lost Parker. And originally, when I met with her oncologist, he's on our medical advisory board. He's also a good friend of ours now. He and I talked about nonprofit, and he's throwing out different ways that this foundation could give money. And at that point, I was like, no, I just want to find a cure, because that's all you want when you are a parent dealing with that. You don't want all the other stuff.
Right.
You want a cure. So I just want the money to go to advanced research. And then some money going to primary children's families that are struggling with that diagnosis. And then we really didn't have goals. We didn't set a money, we need to make this amount of money. We were just more of organically, let's see what happens. These are the two pots that we want to put our money towards: research and families at primary children's, primarily more so research. And then after the first gala, it was such a success. We had no idea. We ended up raising a little bit over $100,000 just on that evening, that event alone.
Yeah.
And it was sold out. I mean, we were blown away. Again, this community is just incredible. And then in the second year, learning more about the families that are dealing with that diagnosis, who have issues with childcare at home. They can't be with their child during chemo because both parents have to work, or there's some of these families are hungry. You think that when you go through this, life is fair, we can give your kid cancer, that will happen, but you're not have to worry money-wise with everything else that life has, thrown at you. It's not. It's life isn't fair, truly. Not to sound negative, but really like we need each other.
Yeah.
We need each other, and these families need support. And I think that's more aligned to where Parker would like to help.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And I'd like to give more money there and keep the research. I think the research is more my husband and I's like intention.
Right.
Because we want to have more treatment options out there for other kids going through this. Because it's in itself, it's traumatic diagnosis.
I love that. I love that it's both a vehicle for you and your husband. And we haven't talked about your children, but I want to talk about your 2 other children, and also for Parker, and to say like, this part is more, healing us, and this part is for her.
Yeah.
That's actually beautiful.
Right.
It's beautiful. So what was your fundraising goal this year, and did you meet it?
Yes, we actually ended up doubling. So we made almost 200,000 this year. We sold out. And if you told me a couple of months before that would be the case, I would be like, no way, because I'm still trying to sell tickets and get the word out. And it's like, I don't think that will happen. And I do think there is this pressure of like running a nonprofit to always like meet your goals. I had done sales in my like early years of pharmacy. I used to do pharmaceutical sales, and I'm a terrible salesperson. That was not a good fit for me. However, it's just that same, intensity of like, oh, you made this much? Well, next year we're going to set it at this goal. And so I didn't do that with little P. I just didn't want to do that because I feel like any money is going towards good, period. However, now that we're trying to help out the families, there's a part of you is like, well, I want to be able to give them more money. You never want to be like, oh, we can't pay. We don't have the funds for their airplane ticket back and forth from Montana to, primary children's. Like, so that's motivating to keep doing this work and make a difference. But I think also selfishly as a parent, you want people to know Parker.
Absolutely.
I want people to know who she is and keep her legacy alive and continue to do good in her name. I think there is something magical about it, that things end up happening the way they needed to happen, not with her passing, but in general with running a nonprofit. Like people come out of the woodwork, like without me doing anything. Mm-hmm. It's that synchronicity component that happens. Mm-hmm. It's like you're working in something that's bigger than you.
Yeah.
And so it's like that energy pulls good towards your nonprofit. And I remember when I met with Parker's oncologist, Dr. Fair, and he said, the main thing with a nonprofit is just make sure it's sustainable. And when we first met and he said sustainable, I thought, well, what's that mean? What does that look like, sustainable? And now I get it, because it does take a lot to run a gala and an event. And I've learned a lot about myself through that. And I think the work can be depleting. And I think if you realize that in order for it to be sustainable, you need to ask for help. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I'm learning to do.
Good. Yeah. So you told me on the evening of the gala that the ticket sales basically just cover the cost of throwing it. Can you just explain? Because that was actually a surprise to me. I don't know much about galas and those kinds of things. So can you just explain to people, one, like the amount of work it takes, because you have one a year, and that the ticket cost is really just covering the cost. So then you have to, everything above that is what is actually funding your nonprofit. Can you just explain that a little bit for folks so they understand? So in order for you to make $200,000 for the nonprofit, how much do you actually have to bring in? And then also, can you talk a little bit about how do you, presumably for the research, because you have such a good relationship with Dr. Fair, you can just sort of say, okay, this is the money allocated to research, and you trust that he's going to put it to good use or help you figure out where it should go. But for the other part, I could see that being a lot of like work just in giving out the funds to families. So does somebody at the hospital help with that, or how is that done?
imagine planning a wedding, but then on top of the wedding, you're going to have a silent auction, and then you're also going to have a live auction, and then you're also going to do a program, and and have people leave inspired.
And how many people were there?
240.
Okay.
And that's not including the dancers. There were 49 dancers for Summit Dance Project. And also want to mention Summit Dance because when Parker was diagnosed, dancing truly is what made her forget about being sick.
Mm-hmm.
And it gave her an outlet to be a kid.
Yeah.
And to see her have joy during all of that was like, I'm just forever grateful for Summit Dance Project. So I knew when we did the gala last year, they had to be involved because it's so much part of Parker.
Mm-hmm.
And that's her community.
And that was wonderful. I just want to pause and say it was really moving. And you could see the energy in those girls for Parker. I mean, you really could see it and feel it. So
Yeah.
it was really special.
Thank you. And she had amazing teachers as well. And Tonya, the studio owner, has been wonderful in coordinating all of this, both years in a row. And she was ready. She was always willing and open to do whatever I asked. Like last year it was Queen. Like Parker loved Queen. And I was like, can you do a medley of Queen songs? And of course she's like, yes. And I loved Queen too. And she was excited. And so this year was like, okay, a little different this year. We're going to do songs with Parker, singing or dancing, and then want you guys to come in. So yeah, that to me is what brought the magic into the evening. But I think when you throw a gala, you have to think about, okay, the venue, you have to find a place where you have to book and rent, and then the food. And then we had a, photography little photography booth. And those things add a DJ. We had the DJ because we did want a portion of the night to just be fun.
Mm-hmm.
Just be fun. And so those things add up. And so really the ticket price is a wash. So our money wasn't made through that. Our money was raised through the auction.
Mm-hmm.
And I had two friends of mine. One is on the board. One is newly on the board. Go around town and ask for auction items. And they work so hard that it was like, that is really what helped us raise that much money. And then as far as primary children's families, we work closely with their social worker.
Okay.
And she gets to know these families. And we had to be very specific. Originally, we were like, this is for any cancer, families who are struggling. And they would come back and say, well, you can go through that money super fast.
Right.
So maybe if you make it more specific, then it'll make it a little bit easier for them to kind of vet out who needs it. So then we said, okay, just sarcoma patients. And even in that, we had to okay, what do you want to help pay for?
Yeah.
Where's the need? We had to have some conversations around that. So Barbie spoke that night, and she's wonderful. She
was
and I
amazing.
worked really well together, and she identifies the family's needs.
Okay.
And I think she and Dr. Fair are very guarded with me doing that because they know that I'm still fresh in the grief.
Yeah.
But that would be really, really hard to sift through families.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so they know their criteria, and so they work with that.
Yeah. Well, it would be so cool if you could make enough that you could put some aside just to grow. And then over time, you could take sort of interest from that to help with families or something like that. So, and maybe you don't want to have a goal for next year. And actually, nobody needs to wait for next year, right? Everybody can go to your website or the Little P Project website and donate. How many donations do you get throughout the year? Or, I mean, I know the gala is obviously the big thing, but do you see people donating throughout the year?
Not as much. There's the Giving Tuesday.
Yep.
And people donate on that day. And here and there during the year, I will say after Parker passed, we had a lot of donations at first.
Yeah.
And that's diminished some. I think people, not that they forget, but it's you move on, life moves on. And so we really do have to make sure people are reminded that there's still a need, and that our intention is still to raise money. And I think actually going back to your goal, and this is like what we've talked about since the gala, is doing some more fundraising through the year, because it's a lot of pressure for one night.
Right.
To be that.
Right.
It is. And so I think if we can look at it more throughout the year, we've talked about doing something in Charlotte, not as a big scale like we had here, but something there, a fundraiser. We have a few board members that are in Charlotte that are going to work on that. I would like to see a race. My brother-in-law does some bike races. So I think things like that would be wonderful.
Yeah.
And but I'm open. Like if you guys have any ideas.
Okay. Well, I will think about it. And really, like, stepping back, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, the goal of the Little P Project at its inception and continuing is, one, for it to exist so that we keep Parker's memory alive and we serve, her loss, and to hopefully increase the amount that's raised each year, both for research and to support families. But honestly, it's not even as much about how much you raise as continuing to do it, because continuing to do it keeps her alive.
Right. Exactly. And I think it gives meaning to the grief and the loss.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening. It helps us reach more people who just might need these conversations. If you have ideas for future guests or have feedback, you can reach out to us by visiting onthetablewithashley.com, linked in the show notes. On the Table with Ashley is presented by our elevated everyday home brand, Amatand, which you can find at amatand.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com. You can follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Amatand. And you can learn more about products related to the Death and Dying series at amatand.com. Thanks for listening.